Hello, today I'd like to talk to you about the exchange variation of the Queen's Gambit, which sounds a bit obscure, but it's actually a pretty central and important topic. And I'd also like to talk to you about the Karlsbad variation and the Karlsbad structure. Let's see all that in a little bit of detail. So the Queen's Gambit, you should know or may know, is this position. Not a real gambit. Black can take this pawn but can't keep it. And the orthodox defence, as so called, black defends with e6, and the exchange variation is any position where this exchange occurs. White takes on d5, black takes on d5, and we get some sort of pawn structure like this, where white's got a half open c file and black's got a half open e file, like that. So that's the exchange variation in general. The Karlsbad variation in particular is a reply to the Swiss defence, which I've made another video about, and lots of move orders, but let's try this one just for example. Very straightforward development by both sides, very solid. And after knight bd7, could have been played earlier, rook c1, which for a long while was the main Queen's Gambit move, and now an idea for black to play a6. And the thinking is that if white moves the bishop on d3, black will force the bishop to lose a move by taking on c4. We'll then follow it with b5. Not quite sure where the bishop will go, maybe e2, maybe d3. And then black can follow up with bishop to b7, and this poor bishop that's been sitting on c8 for such a long while, looking rather forlornly at the back of the e-pawn, suddenly gets a decent diagonal. So this is the Swiss defence. If white doesn't want that to happen, after a6 they can play the Karlsbad variation, which is to exchange on d5, and then we get this structure again with the half open c file for white, half open e file for black, and very often the pawn on c7 will come to c6. And that structure, that pawn structure that we get out of the Swiss defence and the exchanging against it, that's called the Karlsbad variation. This structure, often known as the Karlsbad structure, and a lot of people call it the Karlsbad structure who've never come across the Karlsbad variation of the Swiss defence, which is not exactly mainstream these days. But this structure is, and I'll spend the rest of the video talking about this structure. The exchange variation can be played at any point. Quite a good point to do it is on move 3. On move 4. After move 3, knight to f6 by black. That limits some of black's options from compared with other variations, and so to swap here might be white's might be a good time to try it. And so that's an exchange variation, and it's the Karlsbad structure without being the Karlsbad variation. I hope that's all clear. So let's have a little look at this Karlsbad structure. After t takes d5, e takes d5, and we imagine that white might have developed the bishop at some point and played e3, and black might have developed the knight somewhere else than c6 and played c6. And this is a typical sort of Karlsbad structure, although they've left all the pieces exactly where they are for the moment. Now, conventional thinking was white's got an extra pawn in the middle in the shape of the e-pawn, and what it might be quite nice to do for white is to play f3 and e4 and take over the centre, or at least put some extra pressure in the centre, get some extra squares controlled, maybe threaten to move forward to e5, squashing black, and so on. So that was one idea. However, if you do play e3 and f3, which I guess you must if you want to avoid an isolated queen pawn. Then the e pawn on e3 is effectively backward on an open file, which is not a comfy place for a pawn. So to avoid that sort of problem, then perhaps white should be attacking on the other side of the board and moving the pawns forward up there. So if, for example, white moves up the pawns on the queen side. Now white doesn't have a majority on the queen side, white's got a minority, so this is a minority attack. And if, say, these sorts of moves happen, we might imagine that an exchange happens on c6, and now black's got a pawn that's backward on an open file. So paradoxically, although white has the majority in the centre, they might prefer to advance on the queen side, not where they've got more pawns, but where they've got the half open file. And you can see there's a splendid outpost for white on the c5 square, and this structure is often considered to be advantageous for white. And a lot of white players for years have played this sort of stuff, and some still do, and it's kind of their bread and butter. If they get a Queen's Gambit, we'll swap off, we'll get a Karlsbad structure, and we know how to win these. They can be slow to win, slow and steady to win, but nonetheless you've got a plan, you've got a pull, you know what you're doing, and you can win. Later, I think there was some thought that, well, if black defends a little bit more cleverly, then this position may not be too hard to hold, and for black. And in fact, we know from other sorts of theory that we sometimes say, well, two weaknesses will lose an endgame, but not one. And if black's only got one weakness, well, there shouldn't be any reason to lose. Let's see if we can create a position with only one weakness for black. We'll play a6, which we'll remember from the Swiss defence. And now if advance, swap and swap, and then at a later time swap and swap, then indeed black's only got one weakness on the queen side, and so that shouldn't lose the endgame. And meanwhile might be able to do something on the other side of the board where they've got a minority attack, and also are going to be pointing their attack at the white king. So at least some top players moved away from this idea that the minority attack was such a smart idea in all positions. Still a good idea certainly in some positions, but play a little bit more cannily. And it may be that, in fact, in some positions, the best of all approaches for white might be to go back to this plan of advancing in the centre. So, in fact, the strongest plan in the Queen's Gambit, and you see it in almost every repertoire book that I've seen recommending the Queen's Gambit for white. So you get a book that says how to play the opening as white, and it recommends the Queen's Gambit. These books nearly always recommend the Queen's Gambit exchange variation, and they recommend the system with f3. So playing a little bit more cannily as white, and committing to this plan very early. So that you can start off with white putting your bishops on f3 and c3, and then thinking, oh, now I'm going to advance in the middle, so now I'll move the knight somewhere, and then we'll play f3 and plan to play e4. Well, if you know you're going to do that, well, when you start off in the opening, don't bother putting the knight on f3, put it on e2, bishop presumably on d3 or somewhere sensible, and then you'll save some moves later on when you go for this plan with f3 and e4. So now we think perhaps that this is a better way of playing this plan, and it's quite a dangerous one. So at the moment people think that the best way of playing the Queen's Gambit exchange variation, Karlsbad structure, for white is to play this plan from the white position. So that's the ideas, or at least some of the ideas, for both sides in the Karlsbad variation, and I'll just show you one game where white's minority attack works. I'll show you a game where black's minority attack works, and I'll show you a game where white's central attack works. So this is all about ideas and games, and then we'll look at some theory, perhaps some variations to show you which moves to play, or which moves you can play against white, if white plays this against you in a game. So here's a game I know through Irving Chernev, and it's a game between Larry Evans, the American Grandmaster, and someone called Opsal, who I don't know, and continues, as I've suggested before, with a classic setting for the Queen's Gambit, and now either bishop to e7 or knight bd7 is an idea. And the game continued e3, bishop e7, queen c2, slightly unusual move order, castles, and now white decided to exchange and played knight f3, which is the older way of playing it. These are all very sensible moves for either side. And now to prepare the advance of the b pawn, rook a b1, and now black decided to try and unblock the king side, although at the cost of swapping off a pair of pieces, including their better bishop, with knight e4, swap, and the queen comes to e7 just in time not to lose a pawn on e4. Classic setting for the minority attack. And now b4, a6, a4. And black now played an exchange, maybe that's good, maybe not, and bishop to g4, trying to make trouble on the king side, and clearly now black's really going for it. Last three moves, suddenly there's a whiff of a king side attack in the air. We've got our a3 move, a6 move in early on, so black hopes to restrict their weaknesses on the queen side to just one, and this rook e6 idea is what you call a rook lift, and so the rook is planning to come across and use one of the files on the king side. They're not open files, but because the rook's in front of the pawns, we can use any of them. Nigel Davis, in an article I read in British Chess Magazine many years ago, strongly recommended this rook e6 idea, and well, let's have a look at how it worked out. So b5, continuing with their plan. And this is one of the attractions of the minority attack for white. You just play the same kind of moves in some move order or another, and eventually you get a weak pawn to have a go at. Bishop e6, that should cause white a moment's pause. G3 though, a one move attack with a one move defence. Does that really help black? Well, yes it does, because we've created some weaknesses. Rook a e8 takes on c6, so there's the weakness, and white decides to take out the dangerous black bishop. Swap, and now the knight, which has been lurking on f8 a long way away from the attack, moves up, and rook b6, and white's really ganging up on this weakness, and well, it is weak enough actually now for black need to decide what they're going to do about it. Either ignore it and go ahead, or go back and defend. Now if you go back and defend, that may be that the game has turned a little bit. You've given up the initiative, any hope of initiative on the king side. You're just going to be defending, and you might get ground down psychologically, even if you could have survived according to the computers and so on. So black would really like to keep going forward with a move like knight h4. Can the pawn be gambited? Well, now black's taken on this square. Of course, if the rook wants to move across to the king side, white can just swap it off. So that's no blooming good at all. So I think, well, the analysts better than me think the white king is still safe here, and black doesn't have enough attack, and white's got an extra pawn, and white should win. So whether or not that's true, but black certainly thought something along those lines and played knight e7, queen b4, putting on some more pressure on the queen side. h5, still trying to create some mischief, and now rook b8, trying to invade on the queen side, because I mean, if white attacks the c pawn 4 times and black defends it 4 times, not quite sure where white's going after that. So a queenside invasion, and now the queen comes back across. The invasion of the queenside was just to swap the queens off, and without the queens on, the only thing that's important in this position is not it is white's queenside attack, which survives into the end game, and black's kingside attack isn't really there. So chop chop. There is a weak pawn, if you like, for white on h2 here, but that can't really be attacked with the queens off, and with the queens off white can use the king. So g6, knight up, king f1, here it comes. Okay, playing through this fairly fast just to get the idea of it rather than the analysis. Rook b7, knight c5, I told you that was a good square for a knight. Rook b2, yep, still trying to play actively, quite right. Rook a7, and hitting the knight. Rook a6, hitting the pawn. There's a check, chasing the king away. Rook b2, okay, 7, rook c7, trying to work their way in, and wriggling around with the knight. Now the knight has got a little idea here. Knight king e6, check on f8. Still checking, trying to be annoying. Keeps coming around. And rook b7. And now this is probably an important moment where black played f6. And I suppose this is this may be the difference between drawing and losing this one move. So does it prove that the minority attack isn't really worth it, or does it prove that because what black made this mistake, actually it is worth it because no black player is going to play perfectly? Anyhow, f6 probably wasn't right, because knight h7 and black has to defend. Knight f8. If the king comes to d6 now, it can be taken, so the king has to go to f7, and now white's got the cheeky idea, knight takes g6, and of course the knight can't take. So white has one pawn for the attack. Actually, it wasn't the c pawn after all that fell, but the e pawn. But white's got their extra pawn and has got hopes of collecting more. And the end game continued. Again, I'll just play through very quickly, give the idea. The h pawn weak, check, and now white has a passed pawn. We'll move from an extra pawn to an extra passed pawn, which is important. And that's a bit more manoeuvring. White's trying to get that h pawn going, and now black is going to round up the h pawn, as well they might, and white transforms their advantage from having a passed pawn to a more active king. That's the offer. So white will trundle the king in if they can, and win pawns with a more active king. So that they're hoping to invade that way. Black had a good look at that and decided not to. So rook h6, and a bit more manoeuvring, with a check, and eventually I think black did take this. Didn't take this opportunity. What would have happened if black had have taken? It might have been a bit like the game where white's king is just more active, and white wins that way. So in this position, white will win with by promoting the f pawn. So that wasn't played. King f5 chosen instead, trying to hang on, and So eventually black takes the h pawn in a different move order, but the same sort of idea, that white's going to squeeze black off their opposition defence and win the end game. So actually, as an example of a minority attack, this the weak c pawn didn't fall itself, but the weaknesses and the attack that black had on the white had on the queen side eventually won the game. So that's an example of lots of different ideas in the minority attack, classic minority attack, where white was successful. So there's not really a typical black defence or a typical way of handling this for black. There's lots of different ideas for black in the minority attack positions in the Karlsbad structure, but this is perhaps as close as you get to something where black will meet the minority attack on the queen side by advancing on the king side using their own half-open file and their own minority pawns on that side. So this is a very similar position to we had in the Evans game, and it might be identical, but in this position, instead of playing knight e4, bishop e6, a6, an idea we've seen before. So black now taking advantage of the white taking advantage of these weak dark squares. Knight e4, familiar sort of idea, and takes, and perhaps an opportunity there to take the e4 knight, but if white now takes the pawn on e4, there's a discovered attack over on a7, a7, a2 rather. So if white takes on e4, black will take with the bishop on a2, and it's actually white that ends up with an isolated pawn on the queen side, and but maybe white didn't fancy that. So interesting sort of idea. So white goes backwards with the knight d2 manoeuvre, and now bishop to d5 by black, which obviously nicely defends the c pawn. Not much of a bishop really, more of a tall pawn, but so white hops into the b6 square and says, look at me, and I think black says, so what, I'm going to carry on and try and attack on the other side. So now another exchange in the middle, and in fact the classic Karlsbad structure has disappeared after those two exchanges. Queen c7, black is offered an opportunity to exchange queens, no thanks, and white transfers the queen to the king side, trying to defend, and now the initiative, I think, has quite clearly passed to black. White's still trying to make gestures on the queen side, but it feels to me as though black's just making some nice progress on the king side, and continues to make progress, opening up the king side with f takes g2, queen to h3 looks rather serious, and now the rook lift at long last, rook to f6, threatening to go to h6, and there's actually not too much that white can do about that, so white resigns. Details, I'll put all these games in the notes, so go and find them there, and if you want to check any details in the game, but just to give you an overall impression of how a game might go, and certainly how black's attacking ideas might go on the king side, that's a fair example by black. So just to finish off with an example of the different plan with f3 and e4, not in the modern variation, but in the old variation, and like so much in chess, owes its modern form to Botvinnik. So here we have many of the same sorts of ideas that we've seen before in the Queen's Gambit declined, but white chooses knight ge2 instead of knight f3, leaving that f pawn free. Castle's kingside could have gone the other way if you want to advance on the one side or the other. And Botvinnik, still working out the wrinkles of this system, plays rook a b1, as though they might play a minority attack, and b4 I'm sure is an okay move here. But in the end, f3 and now rook b e1, perhaps showing the rook b1 idea to be either a feint or a mistake, and familiar exchange in the middle, and black plays the rook forward rather than the queen, perhaps hoping to put some pressure on this pawn on e3, which currently is backward, has no friends that can support it from behind. White's playing to look at some of these kingside light squares, like f5. Did I mention f5? There we go. And Keres in this position decides they didn't like that. This is a game of Botvinnik Keres against Russian Championships, I think USSR Championships in '52. Queen to b6, so if White's going on the king side, Black goes on the other side, and e4. So this is the characteristic move of this this plan. Chop chop, and White's got their central majority, and whether or not it's worth a win or not perhaps doesn't really matter. It's just to show the plan, and certainly though after knight d6, White's certainly got a great initiative on the king side, which ultimately proved successful. How would you finish off Black from this position? Perhaps not completely easy, but instead of going on the king side, White chose to switch sides and invade on the occupy the c file. But now there's almost a switch back to the other side. Knight f5, knight h6 check, queen f6, looking threatening, and now the point of all of those manoeuvres on the queen side, that was to get enough time to get a rook to the third rank, and now White has trebled on the f file, which is useful. After rook c8, knight f7, and it's good night nurse. Knight h6, g4, and that was more than enough. So that shows the central plan by White, f3 and e4, perhaps not in the modern move order, where I don't think we would have bothered with rook b1 quite so early, but we'll see that plan in when we start to look at variations. So that's the Karlsbad structure, Karlsbad variation in the exchange variations of the Queen's Gambit.